This project was all about representations of time in art. And I think from talking to some people when we were pushing this project and trying to get the workshops going, there was why, Jonathan? Why are you interested in time in art? I mean, we can understand why you'd be interested in time in physics, because you know, as a philosopher, you're interested in how the world is. We can see how you'd be interested in time in psychology, because again, you're interested in the way that people understand time, and psychology is about how we experience things and what goes on there. In art, what are you doing? Explain yourself. And I guess we came at this from two different perspectives. The first was just an intrinsic interest. So I do a lot of stuff in the philosophy of time. I'm interested in which model of time is right, which one's the right one, how we motivate it, how we understand it. Colleagues in art history are interested in the ways in which art represents things, different things that art can represent. And there's obviously a natural then blend of two different approaches, two different sets of interests. So we were just interested in seeing what happens when you put those two things together. What results do you get? Do you get something that helps art history? Do you get something that helps philosophy? I have an ulterior motive here as well, I should be honest. In the philosophy of time, there's a bit of a standard move to say, when you're developing your philosophy of time, you start with a common sense or intuitive conception. So you try and think through how things seem to us, how they appear to be, and you start there. You'll need to adjust your model to take into account things like physics and things like chemistry and biology and psychology, but you start there. And of course then there are interesting questions about how you access what's common sense to lots of people. Some folks have looked at literature, other folks have done other sorts of things, but we didn't think there was much, indeed if anything, of people looking at artworks to try and articulate and understand the common sense notion. Now, as I say, one particular view that's often motivated by common sense or by intuition is a view that I've done quite a bit of work with, and that view is called presentism. It's the view that only present objects exist. And at least some people think this view receives a lot of motivation from the fact that it always has been commonsensical, everyone's always thought it's about right, and if you look at literature then you'll see lots of presentist ideals being reflected back. So we thought, will those common sense ideas be reflected back in the artwork? Let's go and see. Principally then, what we did was we hosted 3 workshops with the broad remit of exploring the ways in which time is represented in artworks. One of those was a very philosophical workshop, mostly with philosophers talking, although with a big art historical attendance, which was good. Another workshop was much more art historical, although again with a good philosophical attendance. And then the final workshop was a bit of a blend of the two, trying to mix those two approaches a little bit. And I guess lots of different themes came out across the 3 sessions, but I think maybe a few of those are worth bringing out here. The first theme is that we really didn't find much in it for the presentist here. What we did find in Renaissance artworks were a variety of different ways of capturing or reflecting back time. And what normally happens if you've got a single panel that's trying to do some representation of time passing or representing multiple times is simply that different regions of the artwork stand for or represent those times. And quite often there isn't a very sharp barrier between those times. They get blended a little bit. The most sharp cut-off that you'll get is in something like Raphael's School of Athens, where towards the back of the painting you have the distant past, and then on each step as you come forward you get a different temporal layer or a different region of time, figures drawn from different periods. And that didn't do much to suggest presentism to us even then. In fact, it suggested a different kind of a view called the growing Bloc view of time, which says that what time's passing involves is the past existing, and then each time you get a bit of time passing, I guess, you have an addition of a fact or a layer to this block. And that struck us as at least metaphorically quite similar to the School of Athens, where you have stuff at the back, step, 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 layer, 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 fact, fact, fact. This block seemingly growing out towards the viewer. So we couldn't find a lot in there that really favoured presentism. In fact, it really wasn't clear at all what model of time was being suggested, if any, by these artworks. But as best we could tell, nothing presentist, which we did think put pressure on this claim that Presentism always was and always had been a very common sense and intuitive view. We just didn't see anything much coming back for the presentist there. So familiar to us from the philosophy is this idea of an atemporal structure, or things just being out there and real. But in some Renaissance works, we have the difference between personal time as fixed and flowing and God's time, where God's outside our time, looking in on it, seeing the past, present and future, but seeing it as if we might see a space, or like a timeline, if you will. So again, just really exciting and really interesting to see themes that we in the philosophy of time often think of as being quite contemporary, being reflected back in 14th, 15th century artworks. There was then also right the way across the workshops, a really interesting juxtaposition between time being dynamic and being parsy and whooshy and whizzy and timey-wimey, to go for a reference from Doctor Who of late. And then on the other hand, fixed and static and permanent. And I say that's really interesting because as a philosopher of time, we normally categorise views into one of two camps. They're either dynamic or they're static. And fascinating to see that coming out even in the art historical works, where you have art historians saying, on the one hand, we have themes of dynamism here represented by the river winding its way through, and various different natural metaphors standing for things being in change and being in flux. And on the other hand, we have things like in the map of Venice, Venice itself being seemingly fixed and permanent against these tides of change. And that there seems to be a really great scope for collaboration between art history and philosophy, and a real opportunity for allowing art to inform our philosophy and our philosophy to inform our art. And there's just one particular example. In the National Gallery, they released a fox after hours. So the gallery's shut down, lights were turned on, and they captured this fox walking through the gallery late at night. And of course there are all sorts of philosophical ideas about the difference between interpreting an object merely as a thing and then interpreting an object as an artwork. Right? And there's a difference, like a chair isn't an artwork, a table isn't an artwork. Something hanging on the wall in the right kinds of conditions seems to be an artwork. And of course, viewing this fox wandering around the gallery, all these fantastic works of art that if we see, we can't help but interpret as being artworks. You see a fox looking at it, and the fox doesn't care. The fox just sees this thing as being an object, it has no interest in it. And it evokes this idea of a different sense of reality, a different interpretation to the art historian then that's available on this kind of a work. And thinking through it in those terms seems to help us get a bit of a better fix on what might be involved in seeing these things in different ways. So lots of different themes, lots of things I haven't been able to touch on here either, but a really exciting collaboration that led to some really interesting discussions.